Rebbe and Chosid is an open and informative tape which gives us an insight into the relationship between a Rebbe and Chosid. The topic is a very sensitive one, due to the intimacy of the relationship. The love between a Rebbe and a Chosid is as unique a love as our maternal and filial love. It is an experience that was not available before the advent of Hasidus. The discussion brings out what we learned about a Rebbe from our first Rebbe, Moshe Rabbeinu, who was able to bring God to the people and the people to God. A Rebbe, we discover, not only guides the Chosid, but in actuality creates the Chosid.
The subject matter, Rebbe and Chosid, is not the most complicated of subjects, but it is difficult to speak about it because in the course of the 200 years that the Rebbe-Chosid relationship has existed, relatively little has been said on the subject. And the reason for that is because the relationship is a very personal one. It's a personal thing and is always treated as such. So very seldom does a Chosid express publicly his feelings or his relationship with the Rebbe. And even when it is discussed, even when it's talked about, it's usually very brief and in mysterious terms because nobody wants to quite spell it out, being too personal for that kind of exposure. And so it's remained that way for 200 years. But there are aspects of the Chosid-Rebbe relationship that are public knowledge, that are literally part of Torah life, and therefore not only available to the public, but necessary, obligatory on the public to know. Anyone who studies Torah knows that the relationship between Chosid and Rebbe was begun in Dvarim, in the Chumash, where Moshe is repeating, summarizing the events that the people he brought out of Egypt had gone through, what they had experienced during the travels in the desert. And Moshe reminds them of the time when they were standing at Mount Sinai, almost 40 years earlier, and how after the first 2 commandments, which they heard directly from God, the Jews had been too overwhelmed by the revelation and asked that God speak to Moshe, and Moshe transmit the information to them. And in that way they'll be able to bear the revelation and be able to hear what is being said. So Moshe says to them, in summarizing it, he says, on that day I stood between you and God, or between God and you, to bring to you the word of God. Now that statement, Moshe stands between God and the Jew to bring to the Jew the word of God, that basically introduces the whole idea, the whole concept of a Rebbe. And in fact, we refer to Moshe as Moshe Rabbeinu, the first Rebbe, because before that and after that there were other kinds of leaders, there were all kinds of tzaddikim, some of them were called patriarchs, some were called prophets, some were called kings, sages, but Moshe is called our teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu. Now the word Rebbe, composed of 3 Hebrew letters, stands for the 3 Hebrew words, Reish B'nai Yisrael, the head of the children of Israel. And the analogy to the head is meant to imply that just as the entire body lives from the energy of the neshama, of the breath of life, but this breath of life, the neshama, is spiritual and the body is physical, how then do the two get together? The funnel that brings life from the neshama, which is intrinsically alive, to the body that is basically of itself a dead thing, that funnel is the head. Which means that the neshama reveals itself primarily, originally, in the head, and there it is processed in such a way that it can be delivered to the other limbs of the body without overwhelming the body. There are times when the soul, or the energy of the life of the neshama, bypasses the mind, so to speak, and affects the body directly. That's described as ecstasy, or it can be called convulsions. But it is too much for the body. The body can't contain it. And therefore you can't go on that way for very long. In order for the body to live a normal life on a healthy level, the life force of the neshama has to be filtered through the brain. If it bypasses the brain, it overwhelms the body, and that isn't always healthy. So when we talk about the head of the Jewish people, we're not talking only about someone who directs us, who guides us, who leads us. Of course, the head does that too. The head guides the person and leads the person. But more crucially than that, the head is what makes the body alive, capable of responding, of receiving, of reacting to the life that the neshama offers to the body. And that's what gives the body its very life, not only its direction or guidance or intelligence. Every sage, every prophet, every patriarch gave direction to the Jewish people, gave instruction, gave intelligence to our life, to our behavior. The Navi, the prophet, would come and say, don't do this or don't do that, go here or don't go there, offering direction. Sometimes the direction was accepted and obeyed. More often than not, it wasn't. It was ignored. But the function of the leader was to offer direction and to guide. But when we say the head of the children of Israel, when we say the head of the Jewish people, we mean more than only leading, more than advising, more than guiding. We mean providing life itself and then guiding you on how to use the life that was provided. When we talk about the life that a Rebbe gives, we're talking about the spiritual life. The fact that we have any spiritual awareness, any sensitivity of godly things, any desire for mitzvahs, a devotion to being Jewish, all of this comes from the head, as the life of the body comes from the head. In addition to that, the Rebbe offers advice and guidance on how to use that inspiration, how to use that which the Rebbe provides. And the model for that, again, is Moshe. The Gemara says that Moshe was given the entire Torah at Mount Sinai, and he repeated it to the Jews. He funneled it. That was his obligation. But beyond that, Moshe was given the oral law, the details and the explanations of the mitzvahs. Moshe was given this Torah, this oral Torah, as a gift to him. He was not commanded to teach it to the children of Israel, but out of the goodness of his heart, because he who gives abundantly. While he gave us the written Torah, he also gave us the oral Torah. And that's the reason that we say that Moshe gave us the Torah. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe gave us the Torah. What does it mean Moshe gave us Torah? God gave us the Torah. But there's a part of Torah, the oral Torah, that God did not command him to give to us. He gave it to Moshe for himself, and only out of his kindness and his devotion to his fellow Jew did Moshe give that to us as well. He didn't only give it to us by stating it, he made it ours. He gave it to us as an inheritance, which means that in addition to bringing the revelation to the people, the revelation being the written Torah, the Word of God, Moshe also instructed us on what to do with that revelation, how to use the inspiration, what to do with the inspiration, how to express it, how to channel it, how to bring it into everyday life. So the role of the Rebbe is basically this dual role. On the one hand, Moshe says, I stood between God and you to bring you the Word of God, which is revelation, which is giving the Jew his spiritual life in the first place, and then out of kindness he goes beyond the letter of the law and gives them also that which God gave to him as a gift. He gives them also instruction on how to use the revelation, how to use the inspiration, how to benefit from the neshama that was breathed into us at Sinai. And that's why it isn't strange or inappropriate for a Chosid to come to a Farbrengen with the Rebbe, to hear what the Rebbe says, and the Rebbe says you have to do this or you have to do that, and calls for certain projects or certain activity or certain intensification of Torah and mitzvahs, And then the Chosid may find it necessary to seek the Rebbe's advice and ask the Rebbe to help him do what the Rebbe had instructed him to do at the Farbrengen. So it's not enough that the Rebbe has to sit there and tell you and remind you and make you aware and inspire you to do what you have to do. But beyond that, should you find it difficult to do what he has just told you to do, it is also the Rebbe's role that he help you do and overcome that difficulty so that you can accomplish what he instructs you to accomplish. So it's not only a question of giving direction, but also shouldering part of that job and helping you, working with you to help you accomplish what he demands of us. The Rambam puts it in different words. The Rambam says that it's a mitzvah, it's an obligation, a duty upon every Jew to know that God prophesies to human beings, that God speaks to people. What does it mean that God speaks to them? Does he carry on a conversation? It means that God makes himself known through a person. Of course, the first experience of that was Moshe. God came along and spoke directly, face to face, to the people and gave the first 2 commandments, and after that he made himself known only through Moshe. So we now have 3 experiences of God. The first was Avraham. Avraham came to recognize God by observation of the physical planet, of nature, and by process of elimination, he came to the recognition of the true God. He examined the world, he looked at nature, he looked at the physical universe and decided that there was a God, and that God was not any of these visible or tangible things. Nature was not God, no part of nature was God, and through this process of elimination he came to know what God is. Jews came to know God through revelation. And then in addition to that, they came to know God through Moshe. So there are 3 ways that God makes himself known. He makes himself known through the world, through creation. He makes himself known through revelation, which is the giving of Torah. And he makes himself known through Moshe, through a Rebbe, through a human being. And that's why the Rambam says that it's not a question of believing that God once spoke to prophets, but that we are to know, not only believe, but to know, that God makes himself known through man. Not that he once did, but that he does. That one of the ways of perceiving God is through those exceptional people who are a reflection of God, through whom God makes himself known. The obligation in practical terms of a Rebbe are 2 things. First of all, to teach, to bring information, to reveal parts of Torah that are not yet revealed, to offer insights into God that have not yet been offered. And that's why every Rebbe, by definition, has to reveal something that was never yet revealed. And in that sense, although generally we say that the generations are constantly declining, each generation gets lower and further from the truth than was the previous generation. And this is true of all generations. But it's only true of the average person of the generation. But the heads of the generation, or the heads of the people in each generation, don't decline at all. On the contrary, the further we go from Sinai, the further away we are from Avraham, from creation, the higher and the greater the contribution of that head of the people must be. Because the Rebbe means bringing revelation. If it was already revealed, then it's not bringing anything new. So if somebody gets up and says, let me tell you the word of God, thou shalt not kill, then he's not a prophet, he's not a teacher, he's not a Rebbe, because it's already been said. He's not bringing another revelation. So if a Rebbe today says what the Rebbe of yesterday said, and not more, then where's the revelation? So each generation of a leader, each tzaddik of a generation has to be greater than the tzaddik of previous generations. So the first role of a Rebbe, as we see from Moshe, was that when Moshe took over speaking after the first 2 commandments, he didn't repeat the first 2. They had been said already. They had been revealed. He brought them that part of Torah, those other 8 commandments that had not yet been said. Secondly, the role of the Rebbe is that he brings a Jew back from sin. And we see this from Moshe as well. Moshe says, I stood between you and God to bring you the word of God. And to be standing between the Jew and God would mean that he has 2 obligations, 2 commitments, one to God and one to the Jew. Because if you stand between God and a Jew, then you have to represent both. You have to be the intermediary that joins the 2. So the first part of Moshe's responsibility is to stand between God and the Jew, meaning to bring God's message to the Jews. In that sense, he is representing God. He's serving God, bringing God's message to the Jew. That's the part of the Rebbe that teaches and reveals, that unveils newer insights into Torah. And then there's the obligation that Moshe has to the Jews, representing the Jews before God. And that's the part of Moshe where when the Jews sinned, Moshe comes to God and prevails on God that the Jews be forgiven. And we find with Moshe that he had Mesiras Nefesh. He put his life on the line in both areas. In his representing God to the Jews, he was willing to die in carrying out his obligations. In representing Jews to God, he was willing to die for that as well. For example, we're told that when Moshe went up to heaven to receive the Torah, the angels refused to let it go. They challenged his right to take Torah down to earth. And he put his life in danger to struggle and argue with the angels, and ultimately prevailed and brought Torah down from heaven to earth. In a very simple sense, he went up the mountain to receive the Torah. He was there 40 days and 40 nights, without eating and without drinking. He certainly didn't sleep. And that is literal self-sacrifice. He gave up his physical life for those 40 days and nights in order to bring Torah down to earth, representing God. On the other hand, when he was pleading with God to forgive us for making the golden calf, he again put his life on the line. He said, if you don't forgive them, then erase me from the Torah. Then erase me from your book. And even though God said, let me destroy the people who are here now, all except Moshe's children, and then I will rebuild the Jewish people from your descendants. So they will still be a Jewish people. They will be descendants of Abraham, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I will be fulfilling my promise to them. But this particular group of Jews, let me wipe them out. They're no good, and we'll start fresh. And Moshe says, no. If they don't go, I don't go. Erase me from your book. So Moshe's devotion as a representative to God was to such a degree that he was willing to die carrying out that responsibility, and at the same time his responsibility to the Jewish people was so intense that he was willing to die for that too. How does a Rebbe bring a Jew from sin, away from sin? Here too there are 2 parts. It says that the look of a tzaddik is a blessing. The look of a tzaddik revives. The look of a tzaddik inspires. The look of a tzaddik, when a tzaddik looks at you. There are many levels of love, many levels of human connection, human bonding. Each level of love has its unique expression. Different kinds of love find expression in different kinds of ways. There is a love that is expressed through action, doing someone a favor. There's love expressed through speaking words of love. There's a love expressed through kissing, through embracing. And there's a love that can be expressed only through a meeting of the eyes, through looking. It can't be said in words. It can't be expressed in action. The only thing that carries, the only vehicle, the only medium through which this kind of love can be conveyed is through the eyes, through a look. The look of a tzaddik, particularly a Rebbe, heals for 2 reasons. First of all, the Rebbe's look, when the Rebbe looks at a Chosid, at a Jew, he looks for the Jew in him. And by finding it, by contacting that part within the person, it helps activate and reveal that goodness within the person that automatically displaces the sin. Because every Jew, even the worst Jew, wants to be a Jew. For whatever reasons, his desire to do good is overwhelmed by the distractions and by the temptations of the animal soul or the Yetzer Hara, and over the course of time, with repeated transgression and indulgence, his desire to be Jewish gets buried under tons of garbage, but it is still there. And the Rebbe's ability is to look through all this negativity, look through all this garbage, and spot the goodness. And that alone activates the goodness, energizes it, gives it the strength to break through to the surface and reassert itself, so that the Jew regains control of himself and he's once again an active, alive Jew. That's the first part. But as in physical healing, there are two aspects. One is that you protect the parts of the body that are still healthy. You protect it from the spreading disease. And secondly, you have to heal that limb or organ that had already contacted the disease. So by contacting that part of the Jew that is still good and still healthy, the Rebbe is doing the first part of healing. Because for a Jew, sinning is unhealthy. So the comparison is a literal one. A Jew who is sinning is unhealthy. And in healing that, there is the first part in that you have to strengthen, encourage, and protect that part which is still healthy, those limbs of the body that are not yet affected by the disease, so that they shouldn't get sick. But after that, you also have to heal the parts that are already sick. And so it's not enough to say certain limbs in the body may be unhealthy, but we'll ignore it and deal only with the good part. And it's not enough to say that we pay attention only to the diseased limb and forget about the healthy part. Even when a Jew is sinning, he is still a Jew, which means that even when he is sinning, he is a part of God, and he is still precious to God. He is still deeply and vibrantly Jewish, meaning to say that ultimately he identifies as a Jew, so that if you scrape the surface and you want to know what is this person really and who is this person really, the answer will always be, if you're talking really, I am a Jew. That's what I am. That's the real me, the real I. I am a Jew. But at the same time, the I may be healthy, but the hand of this I is not healthy, because the hand doesn't put on tefillin. The hand doesn't give tzedakah. So you basically have a living Jew. He is alive. He identifies as a Jew. He's valuable. He's precious. He's special. He's a part of God. But his hand is not getting that life, that which makes him a Jew is not flowing through the hand. The hand is ill because it's not putting on tefillin. Or the person is basically alive, but his mouth is not, because it won't express words of Torah. It doesn't say words of prayer. It doesn't speak holy. And so on with all the parts of the body and the different mitzvahs that the body does. To say that this hand is not holy, it doesn't put on tefillin, his week is not holy, he doesn't keep Shabbos, his family life is not holy because they don't keep mikveh. But those are only parts, those are only limbs. But as long as the person is basically alive, then why should we bother and be concerned with limbs? That really doesn't make any sense. Just as in a human relationship, if we love someone, we love the person himself, we love that being, but if the love is the way it should be, if it's a true love, then every part, every detail, seemingly insignificant details of that person suddenly become essential and indispensable. So that if you really love someone, you would be deeply hurt you would be deeply disturbed if a hair on their head was harmed, as the expression goes. Why? It's not mortal. It won't kill anybody. It's not fatal to have your hair harmed. You can live without your hair. But when you love the essence of a person, the essence spreads to the details, and all of a sudden you can't distinguish the part from the essence, the detail from the essence. Everything becomes essential. That's the power of love, because it's all one being, it's all one thing. When the Rebbe looks through the garbage that a person had accumulated around himself, and he contacts that part of the Jew that does not sin, this does both things. It strengthens the healthy part simply by making contact with it, and heals even the part that has been unhealthy by bringing the healthy part to bear on the unhealthy part. And so the healing powers heal even that part of the body that had become unhealthy. A little story to illustrate this idea. I heard from a Chosid who was sent to a city to establish a Chabad house there, to open a Lubavitcher center in the city. And he began looking around for supporters, for people who would help him finance the project. And he went to visit this wealthy man in the community, in his home. And he comes at the appointed time to the house, and he enters the living room, and he sees on the mantle over the fireplace, he sees a picture of the Rebbe. He was a little taken aback, didn't expect to find it. And he says, "What is this?" So the man says to him, "Aren't you a rabbi?" And he says, "Yes, I'm a rabbi." So the man says, "Well, if you're a rabbi, then you should know who this is." So the Chosid says, "Yeah, I know who it is. I'm surprised to find the picture here on your mantle." So the man says, "Well, let me tell you a story." He says, "My wife and I were married for about 11 years, and we had no children. Of course, we tried everything, went to every kind of doctor, every kind of healer, and eventually they told us to give it up, and we had just about decided to go out and adopt. We were actually in the process of adoption, and I had to be in New York on business. I met an associate there of mine, and we went to a restaurant to talk business, and after the business part, this friend, this associate, began talking about his family and his children. He took his family picture out of his wallet and wants to show me his children. He must have noticed that my face had turned white, the color had drained from my face, and that I was very uncomfortable. So he says, "What's the matter?" And I explained to him that we were not blessed with children, and that it hurts me. So he apologized, and he didn't mean to hurt me, he didn't mean to upset me. But then he says, "I'm not a Chosid, and maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but I've heard a lot about a Rebbe in Brooklyn, the Lubavitcher Rebbe." He says, "Why don't you go to the Rebbe? Go and ask the Rebbe for a bracha." To me, it was totally unthinkable. It was completely out of my universe. It was out of my world. There was no way I could do that. And besides, I had already had a ticket, my return trip, and I had to make this plane at LaGuardia at a certain time. So I went off to the airport, and I find out that my plane had been delayed for about 2.5 hours. And that kind of struck me as something more than a coincidence. So I thought to myself, I said, "Look, I'm in New York. I have no intentions of making a special trip back to New York to see the Rebbe. But I've got 2 hours. Now I can either sit here at the airport and wait for my plane, or I can take a taxi and run into Brooklyn and ask the Rebbe for a bracha. What could it hurt?" So he grabs a taxi and he runs into Brooklyn, and couldn't get an appointment with the Rebbe on the spur of the moment, but he waited by the door when the Rebbe walked out to daven mincha, And he approaches, he steps out of the crowd, and he approaches the Rebbe, and he wants to say something, but he gets all choked up, and he can't talk. So the Rebbe says to him, he says, you want to talk to me? And all he could do was nod. So the Rebbe motions for him to follow him, and he walks back into his room. They stepped inside, the Rebbe closes the door, and standing there by the door, the Rebbe says, so what can I do for you? So he tells the Rebbe that he's married 11 years, there are no children, he's tried everything, and he wants a bracha. So the Rebbe says to him, do you put on tefillin every day? And he said, no, I haven't worn tefillin since my bar mitzvah. So the Rebbe said to him, I'm a businessman, and you're a businessman. We have no time to waste. I'll make a deal with you. You promise me to put on tefillin, I promise you you'll have children. The man was totally taken aback. I mean, this was like, he expected that the Rebbe would offer good wishes, a prayer, something spiritual. And here the Rebbe puts him right up against the wall, and he says, we'll make a deal. You put on tefillin, I promise you children. He didn't know what to make of that. Somehow he managed to agree. So the Rebbe said, you promise? He said, yes. So the Rebbe said, so do I. And the Rebbe went on, walked out, went to daven. So the man, telling the story to the Chosid, says, and you see, that's why I have a picture of the Rebbe on my mantelpiece. So the Chosid says to him, no, so what happened? So the man takes him into the room off the living room where 3 of his children were playing. The punchline of the story is not that the Rebbe can offer blessings or that the Rebbe can guarantee children. What we have from the story is that a man walks into the Rebbe completely cold, strangers, supposedly. And yet the Rebbe cuts through that strangeness, 40 years of not putting on tefillin, of not being involved with Yiddishkeit, of being estranged from everything, and the Rebbe says to him, promise me you'll put on tefillin. I couldn't get such a promise out of anybody. Why should a guy suddenly change his life because you told him to? And it's not that he was willing to do anything to have children. That doesn't really explain it, because there's no way that this man could possibly have been convinced that putting on tefillin would bring him children. He couldn't possibly think that way. He couldn't possibly believe that, at least not consciously. This was a totally foreign concept. Because I put on tefillin, that's why I'll have children? And yet he agreed to put on tefillin. Why? Because the Rebbe cut through and touched that part of him that cannot say no to tefillin. Why can't he say no to tefillin? I have no idea. That's the way a Jew is. So here we have both parts. It's not just that the Rebbe was able to find the part within him that can't say no to tefillin, the part in him that is still vibrantly Jewish. He was able to immediately bring it out, to affect the arm that has been without tefillin for 40 years. So the healthy part was contacted, the healthy part immediately flowed to the limbs of the body, providing life for them as well. A healthier hand, a healthier body, because the soul was more revealed in the body, and so they had children. What is the connection? Obviously, a healthy person can have children. Another thing, the relationship between Chosid and Rebbe has no parallel. I mean, people are always trying to understand, trying to give some definition to the Chosid-Rebbe relationship, and in trying to do that, they want to compare it to other kinds of love. So they say, what is this relationship between a Chosid and a Rebbe? Is it like a father and a child? And you say, well, it's not quite that. It's that, but not, that doesn't yet describe it. You say, well, then is it like the love that exists between a teacher and a student? You say, well, it's that, but that's not quite it either. So, well, is it like the love between a husband and wife? No, it's not quite like that either. She said, well, then what is it? And the only way to explain what it is to say that just as the maternal love is a distinct, unique kind of love that exists only between a mother and a child, that filial love exists only between a husband and wife, Hasidic love, if we can call it that, exists only between a Chosid and a Rebbe. It's a unique kind of love. It's a love that had not been available to the human experience prior to the advent of Hasidus. So a whole new dimension, a whole new phenomenon of love was introduced when the Rebbe-Chosid relationship was introduced. And so the only way to describe the Chosid-Rebbe relationship is to say that it is a Hasidic love. All comparisons won't do justice to the subject, which means to say that a Rebbe does not love the Chosid for any particular reason other than the fact that he is a Chosid. Nothing creates that love, and therefore nothing can destroy it. It's a unique love. It's an absolute love. It's not rational. It's not human. It's not natural. It's an absolute thing, and therefore cannot be reproduced simply because we would like to. We can't have that kind of love in any other relationship. An average relationship is based on certain qualities, certain shared experiences, certain common interests that can be reproduced. If you enjoy people who play a good game of tennis, well, you can play tennis with almost anybody and enjoy that person for the same reason you enjoyed the first person. You can do it with anyone. Because given those conditions, the relationship can be built around that condition. In Tanya, the Rebbe explains that even a person who rebels against the Rebbe, or against the tzaddik, or against the prophet of a generation, even that person is inspired by the tzaddik. Only the inspiration doesn't come straight in a pleasant face-to-face manner. It comes indirectly. It comes in spite of the person. It comes in a concealed form. The person doesn't recognize, doesn't realize himself that his inspiration is coming from the tzaddik. In other words, the bond between the tzaddik and the people of his generation, the bond between the Rebbe and the Chassidim of the generation, is an absolute condition that exists even when we don't participate actively in that love, as it would be in a maternal love where the child loves his mother even if he insists that he doesn't, because it's an absolute love. There's the famous story in the Chumash of Korach, who challenged Moshe's leadership. And he came to Moshe and he says, why do you elevate yourself above all other Jews? Why do we need you? Every Jew is holy. Why do we need spiritual leaders when every Jew is spiritual? Now we find in the story a very, very interesting contradiction. On the one hand, Korach really meant what he was saying. He wasn't a charlatan. He was a leader of the community, the head of a tribe. And when he said that he was annoyed, that he is bothered, he objects one Jew setting himself above others because all Jews are holy, he meant it sincerely. And he wasn't mistaken. All Jews are holy. All Jews are precious. The irony of it was that where did Korach himself get this insight and this appreciation for his fellow Jew? Where did Korach get this inspiration that all Jews are precious and holy to God? Who gave him this devotion to his fellow Jew? It was all from Moshe, because Moshe was the leader of that generation, and all spiritual life flows from the soul of the Rebbe, of the leader, of the tzaddik of the generation. And yet he turned it around and said, who needs you? I appreciate all Jews. But that itself, where did he get that appreciation? Who inspired him in that? Who aroused that within him? Who brought him to such a level that he was able to see the preciousness of every Jew? Moshe. And yet he himself was rebelling against Moshe. So even as he rebels, even as he objects to Moshe's leadership, he is being inspired by Moshe, he is receiving his inspiration from Moshe, which shows again that even the rebellious child, even the wicked son, is still a son. That will never change. You're still your father's child. You can rebel against him, you can deny him, you can refuse him, and in the end, it's from him that you get your life. And the same is true with the absolute love of a Chosid and a Rebbe, of the tzaddik and the people of his generation. Now, what a Chosid does for a Rebbe, and what the Rebbe does for a Chosid, is without limit, completely infinite. Therefore, it wouldn't be correct to say, as some do say, that the Rebbe is one who helps a Chosid realize his potential. That would be an understatement. As one famous Chosid put it, the Rebbe doesn't just inspire, he revives the dead. Where do you see the Rebbe reviving the dead? So he explained. He says human intelligence is very cold and dead. There is nothing as dead as intellect, nothing as lifeless, as sterile, as cold as human intellect. And yet the Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, came and breathed life into intellect, so that a person can study and comprehend godliness and be moved by it. That's reviving the dead, breathing life into a dead thing. So what the Rebbe does for the Chosid is far more than animate him and inspire him to greater and better things, helping him actualize or realize his potential. The Rebbe actually gives life where there isn't. The Rebbe revives the dead, so to speak. In practical terms, the Rebbe has built an entire empire, a whole machinery, a network of organizations, of schools and other institutions, and this whole machinery is run by people who are basically under 40. It's a very young organization. A young man right out of yeshiva, newlywed, is expected to move out from the Hasidic community, from the cradle, so to speak, and go into a community where there is a lack of Yiddishkeit, certainly no great abundance of Hasidic activity, and there he and his wife are expected to create an atmosphere, change the atmosphere, and produce a vibrant Jewish community with all the details, with all the traditions, with all the trimmings, as if he were living in Crown Heights. Now, in a tradition, generally the older person is the reservoir of all knowledge, all information, and they are the leaders. So how are we to understand a religious, traditional organization placed in the hands of young people, of average kids? They're not schooled in the art of teaching or leading or organizing, just young people finishing off their yeshiva education. By all rights, it is not natural that they should succeed. It's not natural that they should move a community, turn around the entire atmosphere of a city, take on huge budgets, influence the lives of people, make decisions for people's lives. It doesn't lie within their talents to do all this. It's not within their natural gifts. The Rebbe takes an average person, an average young man, and turns him into something else. Not helps him realize his potential. It doesn't exist within his potential. And yet, these average people are somehow elevated to a level of creativity where they are able to accomplish things that is nothing short of miraculous. Somebody once asked me, how are you chosen to go out in this kind of work, field work, for the Lubavitcher movement. And I was a bit taken aback by the question, because I had never thought of that. Actually, you're not chosen. You're not groomed. On the contrary, you have to volunteer. If you want to go, then you ask to go. What are your talents? What can you do? Nobody asks you that. You're not tested. You're not examined before you go. Nobody determines your talents, determines your abilities. If you want to go and you're devoted to serving, then chances are that you will be sent. Went to the Rebbe's secretary after graduating. I said, I'd like to go on a shlichus. And he said, fine. You want to go to Germany? I said, no, not particularly. He didn't ask me what I can do. He didn't ask me for a resume. He didn't ask me for what my experiences are, what my talents are. There was no such question. You want to go? I'll find you a place. How about Germany? Not Germany? Okay, find someplace else you want to go. On the contrary, if somebody came along and said, I would like a job as a rabbi in a big community because I feel qualified to do that job, then forget it. Then you don't get a job, even though you're qualified. Because Lubavitch is not a placement bureau. It's not an employment agency. You have talents, go find a job. You want to be a messenger, a shliach of the Rebbe, then talents are not crucial. It doesn't matter what your talents are. On the contrary, if you think you have a talent, then you're too confined, you're too limited, you're too restricted. You're only good for that one thing. And then it's not the real thing. You want to use your talents? Find a job. You want to be a shliach? Then go to Germany or France. But you don't speak French? Nobody cares. Nobody worries about that. You'll go, you'll learn, you'll do. As a matter of fact, there are shluchim and directors of Lubavitch centers in America who after 12 years still don't speak English. There's an expression, Hebrew expression, that's very real to life. The expression is, if God wants, then a broom can shoot. If the Rebbe wants, a broom also shoots. It makes noise, it has an effect, but it's a broom. The Rebbe can take brooms and turn them into effective teachers, into effective leaders, more than what they are. There are no words that can express a devotion, and therefore you have to kind of talk around the devotion. You have to talk around the love, and there are no words to describe the blessing that comes from having a Rebbe. Not the blessing that a Rebbe gives. We can talk about that. That's easy. Everybody talks about that. Endless stories about the Rebbe's blessings and the results. But here I'm talking about a blessing just in having a Rebbe. The optimism, the joy, the courage that a person has in knowing that there is a Rebbe, even though he never has to turn to the Rebbe for any particular thing. Knowing that there's a Rebbe makes life more livable, makes the world less of a jungle, makes history less of a mystery. You can go on living even at times when there isn't for the individual any point to living, any joy in it or any future in it. The Chosid in Russia, for example, who can't write to the Rebbe, can't come out of Russia, so he can't come to see the Rebbe. And yet he continues to be a Jew, he continues to live, he gets up in the morning with enthusiasm. Why? Because there is a Rebbe. And in 1,000 different ways, this makes the life of a Chosid infinitely richer than another person who, by personal standards, personal strengths and talents, is far greater than the Chosid. But he doesn't have a Rebbe behind him. And the result is that the strongest person has his breaking point. The weakest Chosid cannot be broken. because there's a Rebbe. And somebody once said, until there was a Rebbe and Chosid, before there was Rebbe Chosid, there was teacher and student, there were leaders and followers, there were shepherds and their flock, but they felt alone. They were lonely. Teacher was lonely and the student was lonely. The prophet was a lonely man, and that's an understatement. And his followers were lonely. They were guided, they were taught, they were told, they were informed, and they were inspired, but they remained alone. They were lonely. The distance between the teacher and the student, between the prophet and his people, was never bridged beyond communication. The Rebbe and Chosid relationship came about. They stopped being lonely. The Rebbe is not lonely, and Chosid is not lonely. And that is the biggest part of the blessing. What does it take to be a Chosid? Well, there are three things. Firstly, study what the Rebbe says. Train ourselves to think like the Rebbe. It's an attitude, it's an orientation that the Rebbe is constantly offering. By studying it, we eventually develop the ability to think like the Rebbe. That doesn't mean that we know what the Rebbe knows. It's just that we begin to have an orientation similar to the Rebbe's. We look in the same direction. And even though he sees infinitely further, and we can see only past our nose, at least we're looking in the same direction. By studying what the Rebbe teaches, we begin to develop a direction similar to his. We begin to think of the world in the same terms, not to the same depth or degree, but in the same terms. It even comes a point where you can anticipate what the Rebbe's feelings will be because you've begun to think alike. So the first part of being a Chosid is to learn what the Rebbe says. The first part of being a Chosid, as expressed in the story of Moshe, was that he taught the Jews Torah, and they studied what he taught them. Another way is by being committed to those things that the Rebbe is committed to. Practical things. And that's why every piece of information, every insight that you can have into what does the Rebbe do, how does the Rebbe do it, is very precious. Because if we can do the same thing the Rebbe does, it offers another point of contact with the Rebbe. And the third way is to make personal contact, to see the Rebbe privately. And you make that personal, private contact with the Rebbe at a Farbrengen. In previous generations, it had to be in the privacy of the Rebbe's room. But fortunately, for this generation, this contact can be made in more ways than one. There used to be only that one way. You had to go to the Rebbe, you had to be in his room in order to make that one-to-one contact. That kind of connection called yichidus, where you meet not only face-to-face, but neshama to neshama. Today that can be done at a Farbrengen, which is really unbelievable. When you have 2, 3, 5, 600 people in a room, 1,000 people in a room, and everybody is making personal, face-to-face, soul-to-soul contact with the Rebbe if they wish to. There was a woman watching a Farbrengen on television, and she was talking to one of the rabbis in New York, and she says that she caught the Farbrengen on cable TV, and she watched for a couple of hours, but she wasn't very impressed. What left her cold was the fact that the Rebbe came out into the shul, he spoke, they sang, he spoke, and he left. She says, I didn't see anything really warm or moving or touching. A few months later, they were talking again, and this time she says to him, she says, I caught the other Farbrengen on television. And she says, this time it touched me. There was something I missed the first time, but I caught it the second time around. She says, every time the people raise their cup, they don't just shout l'chaim, they wait for the Rebbe to make eye contact. And during that moment, there seems to be a very real interaction, very personal, and she was very impressed. That there is something, in spite of the fact that this is a mob scene, it's a crowd, it's in public, and yet there is something so personal there. Anyone who wants to make an intimate contact with the Rebbe and come away having experienced a closeness can do so, even though it's only for a second. So she says this is an absolutely amazing thing. Reminds me of a story recorded in the previous Rebbe's diary, that when the Enlightenment movement coming out of Germany began infiltrating Poland and Hungary and Russia, they were very organized, a highly organized group, and they sent emissaries to mislead yeshiva students, to practically kidnap them and bring them to Germany to be trained in the enlightened way of being a Jew. And the people would come into a community, they would pass themselves off as Hebrew teachers, as religious Jews, and they would get a job in the community, and they would then select the best students and offer the students' parents to pay for the expenses of an out-of-town yeshiva. And of course, every parent's dream was that their son would attend one of the great yeshivas in the big cities. But they couldn't afford it. So when this teacher would offer to pay for the expense, they would gladly send their child off to yeshiva, and instead of sending him to yeshiva, they would be taken instead to Germany, where they were taught biblical criticism and skepticism and so on, and then they would be sent back to the community to do the same for other children. One such emissary came to White Russia, and that's basically where the Lubavitchers were. He went from shtetl to shtetl, village to village, analyzing the state of the community. And then he would send back reports to the head office in Germany. When he came to Lubavitch, he found a place to stay with a Chosid who was living alone, and he moved in with him. He figured this guy won't get in his way. He was a simple man. It turned out that this particular Chosid was a very wise man. And before anybody else, he became suspicious of his roommate, who had introduced himself as a teacher and expert in Hebrew language and grammar and so on. But he would disappear from time to time, because he would go out to the outlying communities to check on what was going on there, to be able to report back. Anyway, the suspicion became very strong that there was something not right about this guy, and the Chosid who shared the room with him came across a report that this man was preparing to send to Germany, and the whole story came to light. And what they saw in this report was that he was reporting to his home office, to his superiors, that infiltrating this community was not going to be easy. What finally convinced him that this was an impossible task, was that when he would go out into the marketplace to engage the people there in conversation and find out what their thinking is and where their heart is at, in many cases it was the women who were working in the marketplace. So he would talk to the Hasidic women about what they believed and how they behaved in mitzvahs and Yiddishkeit. And he writes in this report that when he would come around to the subject of the Rebbe, the women who were selling fish or chickens or whatever it was wouldn't enter into the conversation about a Rebbe, about their Rebbe, without washing their hands. And he said when he saw this, he realized that there was no way that they were going to corrupt these people. The truth is that the bond between a Rebbe and a Chosid is so intense and so tangible, so palpable, that the expression was coined, if you cut open a Chosid, you'll find a little piece of the Rebbe. A cute story. Chosid once died, and his soul came to heaven. So they checked his record books and it wasn't very positive. And they said, based on what we see here in your record books, you have to go to Gehenna. And he said, well, that's okay. He didn't really expect anything better. He says, but I've got one problem. He says, I never go anywhere without asking the Rebbe. And so I can't just go. I have to ask. The Heavenly Court decided that they would check this out. They would check his records and see. If it's true that he never went anywhere, never changed location without asking the Rebbe, then he has the right to ask the Rebbe about this move as well. And if not, then he wouldn't be allowed to ask. So they checked, and sure enough, he had never moved without asking the Rebbe. And so they said, fine, we'll go ask the Rebbe. It just so happened that that particular day the Rebbe was sitting at a Farbrengen. It was during a meal of some sort. I forget what the occasion was. It was during the week at some festive meal, and the Rebbe had been talking and singing and discussing, and all of a sudden the Rebbe said, no. It was out of context, it was disconnected, and people didn't understand what that was directed at. And the Rebbe later explained to one of his close Hasidim that he had been asked, can this Chosid, so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, go to Gehenna? And he said no. And so he didn't. The story is valuable not only for what it means to a Chosid after life, it's what it means now. There are certain hells, there are certain Gehennims that we go through here on earth if we're not careful. But when we have a Rebbe, and because we're tied to the Rebbe, there are certain places where even though we might be tempted to go, and conditions might ordinarily drag us there, we end up not going because the Rebbe says no. There are places a Chosid can't go because he's a Chosid. And even though by personal disposition, by personal moral quality, he could possibly end up there, only because he's a Chosid, it won't happen. It can't happen. He's tied to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says no. So in spite of himself, he remains good. The kind of leadership that Moshe must have offered, that enabled Jews to come out of Egypt, to rise to the level where they were able to receive the Torah, and then rise to the level where they were able to enter Eretz Yisrael, it must have been an incredible kind of leadership. It's not surprising, Torah itself says, that the Jews came to believe in God and in Moshe, in one breath. We find also when Shaul, King Shaul, regretted having taken the king of Amalek captive rather than killing him as he was instructed. So he says to the prophet, he says to Shmuel Hanavi, I am sorry, I regret that I sinned against you, against God and against you. And here again, in the same breath, because what the Navi does for the people, even for the king of the people, what Moshe did for the Jews in terms of bringing them to God was so incredible and intense that there's no other way to describe it other than by joining it in the same breath. With the devotion and belief in God, there is the devotion and belief in the Rebbe. And if it was true in those days, when the redemption was temporary, the coming to Israel was temporary, when the victory over Amalek was temporary, how much more incredible and beyond description is the devotion to the Rebbe today, who not only takes us out of Mitzrayim, out of our own limitations temporarily, but who actually prepares us to go out of Golus permanently, eternally. So there's no question that every day when you have an opportunity in the benching, in the blessing after bread, that we offer a bracha to the Rebbe, and we wish him health and nachas, all the blessings he can absorb. And that opportunity to offer that blessing to the Rebbe should not be missed, because we owe him an incredible debt, one that we cannot begin to imagine. And the Rebbe officially, in his kindness, relieves us of that debt. There was a rabbi from England or Australia, was visiting with the Rebbe, and he was on his way to Israel. And the Rebbe asked him to do something there, to take care of something for him. And the rabbi says to the Rebbe, I hope that I will succeed in my mission and that the Rebbe will be satisfied. So the Rebbe says to him, succeed to a degree that you will be satisfied. My appetite you won't satisfy. So the Rebbe says, don't feel obligated to satisfy my needs. Satisfy yourself to your satisfaction. Succeed to your satisfaction. He relieves us. We are released from the indebtedness, from the obligation, because we couldn't possibly live up to it. We'll never be able to pay back the debt. What we owe the Rebbe, even on the most external level, turning America around, making America receptive to Yiddishkeit, introducing the notion of tshuva for our generation that has now become the only thing worth talking about. Not just receptive to becoming a center for Yiddishkeit, but actually turning our lives around, for presenting all the opportunities for inspiration, for growth, to where we, all of us, are more Jewish than our native talents would dictate. And that's because the Rebbe is the funnel, and he funnels everything. For 33 years, without a coffee break, never mind a vacation. And I mean literally without a coffee break. There was a time when the Rebbe had a very hard, dry cough, and Rabbi Groner, the Rebbe's secretary, was very bothered by the Rebbe's discomfort. And through the door he could hear him coughing. And it was one of those nights when there were visitors, a visiting night, when the Rebbe was seeing about 40 people that night. And he was going to be up till the sun would come up. And the cough was getting worse. So Rabbi Groner goes and he brings a thermos with hot tea, and he brings it into the Rebbe's room and was going to put it down for the Rebbe to take, and the Rebbe waved him out of the room. About 4:30 in the morning, all the visitors had come and gone, and Rabbi Groner comes in to the room to take last-minute instructions or whatever, and he was a little hesitant because he thought maybe the Rebbe was angry at him for having interrupted the visitation with the tea. And he didn't know what to think. So the Rebbe said to him, how could I drink tea while people are waiting to see me? People are waiting and I should sit here and drink tea? So Rabbi Groner said, well, it was just for a minute. I mean, it won't take a minute to drink the tea, and it wouldn't be that much of a wait. So the Rebbe smiled, and he said to him, hot tea is not 1 minute, it's 6 minutes. And to make a person wait in the middle of the night for 6 minutes so that I can drink tea, that's not right. So literally, the Rebbe goes without a coffee break or a tea break, so that the opportunity to say in the benching that God should bless the Rebbe, that God should give his blessings to the Rebbe for all that he has done for us, that opportunity should not be missed. In fact, a famous Chosid once said that every time he has a chance to sit down to a meal rather than grab a snack, he would rather do that, because when you sit down to a meal, then you have to bench, and when you bench, you have a chance to say the blessing there for the Rebbe. And the Rebbe once told somebody that a simple Jew who lived somewhere in a shtetl, this was the previous Rebbe, when he said in the benching that God should bless the Rebbe says, I feel it. It gives me strength. How does it all start? How is a Rebbe chosen? How does one become a Rebbe? The expression head and shoulders above everybody else comes from a description of King Shaul. He was head and shoulders above everybody else. And since it's an expression in Torah, it carries more meaning than meets the eye. Shaul was not necessarily taller than everybody else. Head and shoulders above obviously means something about the quality of the person rather than his physical size. What does it mean to be head and shoulders above the others? Basically, the head is the seat of intellect, and shoulders are the emotions. A right shoulder and a left shoulder, the positive and the negative, the love and the fear, kindness and severity. Shoulders are basically the emotional result of intellect. You think about something, you understand it, and based on what you understand, you will either like or dislike this particular thing. You'll either be moved towards it or you'll be moved to avoid it. So basically the shoulders represents the emotions. When you say that someone is head and shoulders above everybody else, it means literally that the shoulders of this person is higher than the head of the other person. Which means to say, in reference to Shaul, for example, that Shaul was closer to God in his emotions than all the other people on their intellectual level. Intellect is supposed to be closer to the truth than the emotions, because emotion is subjective, intellect is objective, and yet with Shaul, even his emotions were truer than the intellect of the others. What others are struggling to understand is to Shaul a daily experience. What then does Shaul struggle to understand? That's beyond our imagination. If what we have a hard time understanding is to him everyday experience, so what would he have a hard time understanding? That's beyond us completely. It's awesome that people have to get together and decide who will be their Rebbe. I can't imagine how anybody makes that kind of choice or that kind of decision. But somehow, Jews have a chush, a talent. Jews do not accept leadership easily. By nature, we don't accept leaders. As a matter of fact, we're ruthless with our leaders. We don't easily accept leadership. When Jews get together and agree that a certain individual is a leader or should be a leader, it's an exception to the rule, and it's very unlikely that it should be wrong. There was a time when the previous Rebbe's father was considered the new Rebbe because his father had passed away, and the Chassidim were split. Some of them believed that the Rebbe's father, the previous Rebbe's father, should become the new Rebbe. Others believed that his brother should become the Rebbe. So the Rebbe Marash had left two sons who were both being considered as possible Rebbes. So some of the Chassidim went to Reb Zalman Aaron, and some of the Chassidim went to the Rebbe Rashab. It was 10 years before it was agreed and determined that the Rebbe Rashab was the Rebbe. When it was determined, one of the Chassidim who had all these years been going to the Rebbe's brother as a Rebbe, to the Reb Zalman Aaron, this Chosid went to Reb Zalman and he said to him, "So is it true? Is your brother really the Rebbe?" So Reb Zalman Aaron, who was obviously an incredible man himself, said, "Well, it's one of two things." He said, "Either my brother is a Rebbe, or my brother is a liar. And I know my brother, he's not a liar." So the role of the Rebbe, the authority, the position, the responsibility of the Rebbe is such that either the Rebbe is a Rebbe, or it is a horrible lie. Knowing that the Rebbe is not a liar leaves us with the conclusion that the Rebbe is a Rebbe. When Begin first became prime minister, and he made his first visit to America, he went to see the Rebbe. And this was the first time a prime minister had come to the Rebbe. And somebody asked Begin, is it right for you to go to the Rebbe? After all, you're the prime minister. Shouldn't the Rebbe come to you? And Begin said, no. He says, I go to the Rebbe because the Rebbe carries the responsibility for the Jewish people on his shoulders more than I do. To some degree, the Prime Minister of Israel is responsible not only to the people of Israel who live in Israel, but to some degree, he's responsible for what happens to all the Jews all over the world. But the Rebbe's responsibility is not indirect, it's direct. The Rebbe carries a direct responsibility for all Jews all over the world. And somehow Begin was able to sense that, recognize that, and admit that. The Prime Minister of Israel is the Prime Minister of the land of Israel, but the Rebbe is the Rebbe of the entire Jewish people.